Welcome into a brand new edition of the 06010 ESPN Communications podcast. I'm your host, Alex Feuz, and we have a very special guest, Karl Ravech. He's been a cornerstone of baseball coverage at ESPN for over 3 decades. He used to host Baseball Tonight and now the voice of baseball coverage on ESPN. Karl, thanks so much for joining us on the latest edition of the ESPN Communications podcast. This past season for Sunday Night Baseball was officially in the books, most watched in 5 years. How special was this year for you, Eduardo, David, and then Buster as well?
Yeah, very special. But before we continue, I just want to clarify. So the 06010 communications, is this yours or is this something that's done throughout the company? So you're not the only host. Are you the only host of this podcast?
I am the only host of this
All
podcast.
right, have we thought about renaming the 06010 podcast to what got to know you and now have the nickname the Fuse Box podcast? That reeks of something that brings energy, excitement. You could go 06010 Fuse Box, but somehow we got to get that in there for Alex Feuz. That's really critical, I think. And I don't know what the numbers are. Probably will double them now.
I'll make a note and I'll pass it along.
Appreciate that. To answer your real question, yeah, Alex. The challenge this year, of course, was Olympics, presidential race. There's all sorts of competition, new competition every year. There's competition for the viewers' eyeballs, and the idea that we would finish with the best ratings in 5 years, given those parameters, to me says a lot about the production. It says a lot about the people that work their asses off on the production. It says a lot about the players who are willing to wear microphones and earpieces and contribute each and every week. It's such a fascinating response we get to that. The such a small group of haters, and those are the ones that seem to be out there on social media, will kind of blast the idea and fall on the sword of just show us the game, which is so myopic in the thinking that it implies we don't show the game when we're talking to the players, when in fact, nobody's more passionate about the game and what's going on the field than those of us broadcasting, and certainly those are the guys that are playing. So the idea that is one of the things people kind of die on that hill is such a bizarre response to me. But overwhelmingly, it's approved, and thus the highest ratings in 5 years. So we must be doing something right, and it's a great source of pride for all of us who work so hard. And you know this, people see the end result on Sunday. They don't see all the work that goes in Monday through Saturday to get ready for Sunday.
Yeah, that's one thing I want to hit on. When does the preparation for you as the play-by-play voice of Sunday Night Baseball begin?
Well, it never ends. I mean, the one beautiful part about baseball, and I learned this after doing 20, plus years on Baseball Tonight, when you're around the sport, you are constantly preparing. And the only way to be knowledgeable about baseball is to be swimming in the pool every day. Because I know people have said, if you go away from it for a week, you kind of lose track of who's hot, who's not, which team is playing well, injuries, etc. So in our case, while we know the schedule a couple of weeks in advance most of the time, and sometimes a little bit more, you can focus on those two teams, but you've got to be immersed in baseball. It's the only way that you can follow this sport. I think it's a little different than football and other sports where it's once a week. It's every single day. So if you really want to be in the know on it, you got to follow it every day. Just with regards to Sunday Night Baseball, as soon as the game is over, we kind of flip the page. We have a meeting every Thursday, which involves everybody, but the producer, Andy Jacobson, and I, pretty much Monday morning are talking about the different aspects of what we're about to do, animation, those cartoons that we've become pretty well known for. We discuss Monday. We start writing those. I send them to Andy for approval, and those things go off early so they can be ready. So it's not a question of when you start, it's you just don't stop.
You know this, when you spend most of your life involved in the baseball world, everyone is like a family. How much do you lean on other people in the game as you learn, okay, you're doing, let's say, Mets, Phillies? How much will you lean on the beat writers and other broadcasters around those two teams to help you prepare?
Well, I mean, the blessing and the curse of social media, and I'm dating myself, but even the internet allows you access to all the columns that are being written. And I certainly, like most in my profession, that's one resource that's invaluable, is to find out, what the beat writers, what the broadcasters are saying about their particular team, and use them. But I'd say, equally important for me are the people that I've sat with on the set of baseball tonight. I mean, the managers that are currently in the game, to kind of ask them different questions about opponents and teams. And it doesn't always, and more often than not, involve their own team. It's about a team that we're about to broadcast, their experiences in playing against those teams, what we can glean from, guys that are hot, pitchers, and how they throw, prepare, etc. Some of their weaknesses, some of the things that they tried to attack, some that worked, some that didn't. So it's a combination of all of those things, but I do often rely on those guys that I've worked with who've sat next to me on that set of baseball tonight, that are now managers, to help. And those that didn't too, other people like AJ Hinch and guys that you got to know that have been kind enough to share their phone numbers and information, and the accessibility is huge.
We mentioned Eduardo Perez, David Cone, and Buster Olney at the start of the podcast. How special is it for you to work with them and learn from them? What have you learned most from working with them?
Yeah, well, the 30 plus years I've been there, and having sat on different sets, I mean, one thing that I've always known and learned is, in order for the show to be better, not me, but the show to be better, we got to make sure that, in this case, Eduardo and Coney and Buster are doing their best. And that means, what do I have to do to put them in a position to succeed? And just like a clubhouse, whether it's a major league clubhouse or a locker room, there are just different personalities. And you got to figure out what's going to make a different personality tick. And when you hear something pregame, when you hear something in a meeting, you store that in the back of your mind and you bring it up during the game. It's what worked on Baseball Tonight forever. Green room stuff was hardly stuff that, because it was said in the green room, meant it stayed in the green room. Everybody that worked there came to know, if it's said in the green room, there's a darn good chance it's going to come out on the show. And it doesn't matter about what subject it has to do with. It's not all baseball related. It could be some funny story about some interaction that one of the guys had with a kid, a police officer. There have been numerous stories that are talked about in the green room while we're all watching games during Baseball Tonight that popped up during the show. Same thing happens with Eduardo and Coney. We tend to have breakfast when we're in the city every Sunday morning. Some of those stories will absolutely come back on a Sunday night, and it tends to make for the more memorable moments, because it's not what people would expect. It's not about the 2-2 pitch. It's not about where the center fielder is playing. It's not about the back pick, from a pitcher. So all those things I've come to learn, those are the things that people tend to remember. And having gotten to know them over the last, 3 years, but having worked and covered them my whole career, it's very, very easy. And, Buster's the best in the business at what he does. And we know that. And, it's an awesome team. But again, you're put together 3 years ago. You never know how the hell it's going to work. What you do trust is your ability to get along with people, and that served me really well for a long time. And that's never been an issue. And this year we're all very close. We're all good buddies.
And you four will be on the call for a wild card series on ESPN. Again, the wild card round exclusively on ESPN. But I do want to hit on one thing before we get to that. Is there one Sunday Night Baseball game from this past season that sticks out to you that says that was the most fun we've had and the best game of the year?
I'd say the last couple have been really good, and I think much of that has to do with urgency. I mean, Alex, one thing I've preached about our game of baseball was the need for as much urgency as you can get. And post-COVID, when there were 7-inning doubleheaders, the one aspect of that I loved was the fact that innings 4 and 5 and 3 to some degree felt a lot more urgent than innings 3, 4, and 5 feel in a 9-inning game, just because you're closer to the finish line. The same way that innings 7, 8, feel a little bigger than innings 2 and 3. When we were playing 7-inning games, those middle innings were huge. So now that we're in September, the games take on a greater urgency. And when you're sitting there at Citi Field on a Sunday night and it is packed, and we've done so many great games at Citizens Bank Ballpark, and they're famous for their enthusiasm, their loudness. Citi Field felt that way. That's a big deal. You have a manager bringing in Edwin Diaz in the 8th inning. That's a big deal because it's urgent. Everyone is aware. Like we've moved up in our chairs a little bit that we may not necessarily do in a game in May. And when it's that close, 1-1 late, and Nimmo hits a homer in the 6th to put the home team up, it may be recency bias, but I know that anybody in my position, Alex, they want to be involved in games that matter. And it's not dismissing games in April and May and June, but there's no question. I mean, MLB Network runs an entire promo about September baseball. We tend to do the hunt for October. All of these things add to urgency when you can combine a packed house, a closer in the 8th inning, division rivals, playoff lines, are on the line, all of that. So I may be ignoring some of the games at Dodger Stadium this year and other places, but this most recent one was as electric as we've been a part of this year, which was awesome.
No question. We'll talk about now games on the line. You'll be on the call for one of the wild card series. How different is it for you to call regular season baseball and then transition over into a wild card series?
It's not difficult. I do think, because it is a playoff series that, obviously, again, you just go back to the conversation we just had about April and May games versus September games. And now everything is on the line. So there's probably a heightened attention to detail. Things that happen in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd innings matter, as much as they do every other game, but they're going to have implications later in these games. And you only get 2 chances to fail and you're out of a wild card series. So I think that you just pay a little bit more attention to the details. You attach significance to a move in the 4th inning, perhaps in the 8th inning, the way managers use their benches and deploy, different guys and switch hitters and bullpen usage. It's just a little bit of a heightened attention to those things that you may not necessarily focus so much on during the regular season. I think some of the banter, while it's important to continue and make sure you have fun, let's not forget this is sports and it's fun. And the audience has enough stuff out there that's occupying the serious parts of their minds. It's still sports. It's supposed to be an escape. It's supposed to be fun. Don't ever lose sight of who you are and the authenticity that you bring. But I would say that you're a little more focused on the details and how what happens early relates to what happens late.
Just a few days away from the MLB regular season ending, what team has surprised you most this season?
I think the Guardians have been a big surprise. Obviously, the Brewers, the Central doesn't get the attention the 2 coasts get, that's for sure. And the idea that in Milwaukee, obviously, one team, Chicago, felt like if we could take their manager away, we're going to be a lot better off. And obviously, the Brewers lost their manager, and they never took a step back. In Cleveland, one of our great friends, Francona, is out as a manager. And for all that Stephen Vogt brought as a manager, the one thing, and this goes back to our coverage of baseball that I'll never forget, was during spring training when Tim Kurkjian had asked him to list some of his other talents, and I think he said singing, which led to Stephen Vogt singing one of the Disney songs. I don't know if it was Little Mermaid, but he sang a Disney song and he killed it. I mean, he crushed it. It was beautiful. And that's what I thought. When you think about Stephen Vogt, I think about that more than I do his playing career or anything he did, as a manager. And yet here he is leading the Guardians to a pretty decisive first place finish in the American League Central. So again, I think it's those 2 teams I think if you ask me the team going into the postseason that I'd be most worried about, it'd probably be the Padres today as the team that's best and most equipped for a deep run and perhaps a championship. But those two teams in the Central divisions, the fact that they were able to sustain losses of good managers and have the success they've had are probably the two biggest.
Before we get to the Fast Five, I do want to hit on your passion for the Little League Classic and the Little League World Series, that you are also the voice of that. Where does that passion come from for you?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's, I don't think it's a secret when you combine the aspects of baseball, kids, and then the major leaguers showing up. Alex, you were there. The scene of the New York Yankees and Aaron Judge walking around the two Little League fields and facilities when you have these 11 and 12-year-old kids just looking up at them like they are literally giants. And in Judge's case, he is. And this sort of Google-eyed response from these kids, and it's kids from across the world. It's just an amazing thing to see. It's something that never loses its appeal, because I think in a lot of ways it brings you back to what it was like when you were that age and you had heroes and you had idols and you had this idea like, God, I just wish that I could, how could I ever go see player X? And here you are at the pinnacle of your sport, the Little League World Series, and here come those guys. It's that part of it is just remarkable. And then look, the Little League World Series is such a cool thing because they're playing baseball. We're obviously spoiled because these are the best teams in the world. And I've done it with my boys. Little League baseball isn't always great. There are nights where it's boring. They're making mistakes. It's freezing. Here you get such a high level of play with kids that are not only fun but funny. It combines everything that I love about the game. And I haven't even mentioned the fact the way that it's presented by ESPN and the production crew and the personalities of Frazier and Foudy, to name two of them, to go with everybody else. It's such a potent potion of just wonderfulness. That's why I can speak about. You want this to carry on for another hour? We'll talk about more about the Little League World Series.
Well, this is my favorite part of any interview I do. It's the Feuz Fast Five questions. Are you ready?
Yes.
If you could host a podcast with anyone in your phone contacts, who would you choose and why?
That's a great question. In my phone contacts, who would it be and why? Well, I don't know if you can see it, but I got a little star hanging over my shoulder here. And that, of course, has to do with our dear friend, Sarah Langs. She, of course, is in my phone. She's been dealing with ALS and doing such an incredible job staving it off. There's a lot of celebrities in there and a lot of people that other people know, but very few are dealing with the stuff that she's dealing with. And I think if I could have somebody to have a podcast with who could share all the things emotionally, physically that she's dealing with, to shed more light on this horrific disease, I'm going to go with a podcast with just me and her.
Well, Sarah is the best, and she always says baseball is the best, which is true.
Right.
Second one, best advice someone has given you over the years that worked at ESPN.
It's a great question. And, I give this advice, and I'm not sure I ever heard it, but I might have. For anybody that's working anywhere, ESPN or anywhere else, I would tell them whatever is asked of you, the answer is yes. I mean, that's always the answer. It's not a question of that job is beneath me. I've never done that before. I'm out of my comfort zone. My son works at ESPN and he's now doing a whole bunch of games, and he hosts College Game Day on the digital side. I can't tell you how many times I've said to him, whatever you are asked, the answer is always yes. And that would go to anybody in any field. My wife and I have 5 boys between us. I've told them all. And one's going to be a doctor. One works in IT. Another works in human resources. Like, it doesn't matter. The answer is yes. And, make yourself the least bit of trouble you can for your superiors, and your job and your life will be a hell of a lot easier. And shoot, you'll learn something. Get out of your comfort zone. But the answer is always yes to any requests.
This one might be some controversy answer. Favorite MLB ballpark?
Aesthetically, I'll always defer to San Francisco. I think it's just such a unique ballpark, with the bay and the ships. So it's that only because of aesthetics. So I'll answer it that way, because there's a whole bunch of other ones that are historical and mean different things because of where you grew up and who your family roots for. But if I had to go to one ballpark every day to work, it'd be San Francisco.
Most entertaining MLB player in the game right now?
Um, Boy, that's a great one. There's a few. Lindor is there. Ellie De La Cruz is really fun to watch. Skeens is just unique to watch. But I'll say this, again, let me go back to the Little League World Series and the Little League Classic. Part of that night that was ridiculously special was after we did the games during the day and we got our typical rain delay, which meant like we got to leave a Little League game and Monaco's got to come over and finish it so I can get to the Little League Classic. While we're sitting there with Coney and Eddie and watching the game, you'll remember that Jazz Chisholm was hurt. He wasn't playing, but he was in uniform. And, we're in this building that holds like 2,500 people. It's tiny. But as you're watching the game and doing the game, there is this Yankee, this current player walking around the stadium. It felt like an out-of-body experience. You're kind of looking, because imagine in no other major league ballpark is a player in uniform walking around the stadium and then sitting with fans. Doesn't happen. Maybe that's not a bad idea, and it should, but it doesn't. And Jazz Chisholm was walking around the ballpark, and he's then sitting with little leaguers, and he's in full uniform, and he's fully engaged. His personality is pretty special on every other day, but that night it's like, is that really him? Like, who is wearing a Yankee uniform to? Oh my God, that's actually Jazz Chisholm. He's a player. He's sitting with kids from different parts of the world. It speaks to who he is, and that was a pretty incredible night.
And the last one for the Fuse Five: if you could have dinner with three broadcasters, current or have passed on, who would you choose and why?
Well, Vin Scully, Joe Buck, and this is kind of an obscure one, but I grew up in the Massachusetts area and listened to Boston Bruins games on the radio. And I was never one of those who aspired to be a broadcaster. I was outside playing what I always termed runaround sports. I wasn't necessarily glued to the TV. I've worked and lived with guys who have always wanted to be a broadcaster, and they would, want to be like Bob Costas or Al Michaels. And there was this guy named Bob Wilson who was one of the voices of the Bruins. And I just remember, for some reason, driving home from a game, and they would be doing the post-game show on the radio, and I was with my dad. I mean, I was really young and obviously very impressionable. And I heard his voice reading a bank commercial. And I'm like, good God, like that voice is so unique. Like, there's something about his voice that just resonated with me, more so than guys like Johnny Most, who I grew up listening to because I was a huge Celtics fan. So, that alone may have been what got me interested mildly in broadcasting. I'm not sure, but for some reason it just sticks, like Bob Wilson's voice. The other guys, Scully with obviously his history in both, Brooklyn and Los Angeles, and Joe for all the World Series games that he did. And I have the utmost respect for Joe and what he's been able to do in his career. And to some extent, finding out what my son Sam's going through. Joe followed in the footsteps of his dad. Well, Sam's, attempting to do similar. So what were some of the things that he dealt with? So perhaps I could help make that a little bit easier and smoother for Sam, the way that Jack did for Joe. So those three, for a variety of reasons.
Well, Carl, this was so much fun. Thanks for your time today during the busy stretch for you. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
It's my pleasure. And since you've introduced the Fuse 5, let's just go fuse box. Open up the fuse box, pull out the 5 questions. But we got to get the fuse box in there.
All right, I'll work on that. Thanks,
all right, buddy.
Carl.
My pleasure.